This is the true story of the Canadian Pacific Selkirk Locomotives, based on verified historical records from the Montreal Locomotive Works, Canadian Railway Museum and Railway Engineering Archives spanning 1929 to 1959. Picture this, it's a freezing February morning in 1930, somewhere high in the Selkirk Mountains of British Columbia. The thermometer reads -30. Your train, all 1,800 tons of it, is crawling up a 2% grade, and you can hear the wheels slipping on ice-covered rails. Your fireman's shoveling coal like his life depends on it, because frankly, it does. The boiler pressure's dropping, you're losing speed, and behind you, there's another train waiting and another behind that. This was the nightmare Canadian Pacific Railway lived with every single day through the Rockies. They'd tried everything, double-heading locomotives, banking engines, you name it. Nothing worked. The mountains were winning. So in 1929, they went to Montreal Locomotive Works with a simple request. Build us something that can't be stopped. Something so powerful, so massive, that the Selkirks would finally meet their match. What they got back was a monster, 523 tons of steel and steam, 10 driving wheels, 78,000 pounds of tractive effort, and that's before you hit the booster. They called it the Selkirk class, and it was about to become the British Empire's most powerful, non-articulated locomotive ever built. But here's what nobody tells you about building the biggest. Sometimes, being unstoppable comes with a price you never saw coming. If you're loving this journey into railway history, hit that subscribe button. We're diving deep into machines that changed the world, one story at a time. Now let's talk about why Canadian Pacific was so desperate. Let me take you back to 1885. That's when Canadian Pacific finished the Transcontinental Railway, a ribbon of steel connecting Montreal to Vancouver. Sounds romantic, right? Except they had to thread that ribbon through some of the most hostile mountain terrain on Earth, the Selkirk Range, 262 miles of pure geological fury between Calgary and Revelstoke. Grades hitting 2.2% doesn't sound like much until you're hauling freight, curves so tight they're measured at 12 degrees. And weather? Brother, you haven't seen weather until you've worked a Rogers Pass winter. Avalanches that could bury entire trains, temperatures that froze lubricating oil solid. By the late 1920s, Canadian Pacific was bleeding money on this route. They were running locomotives in pairs, sometimes triples, just to get trains over the summit. That meant 3 crews, 3 sets of maintenance, 3 times the coal. The operational costs were killing them. But the real problem, those heavy Mikados and consolidations they were using, they were maxed out. Physics had a limit, and they'd found it. You can only make a locomotive so big before the weight crushes the track beneath it. The Canadian Pacific Main Line was rated for specific axle loads, and every engineer in Montreal knew, go over that limit, and you're not just breaking rails, you're killing people. So the challenge became this. Build the most powerful locomotive in the British Empire, but make it light enough that it doesn't destroy everything it touches. The first Selkirk, number 5900, rolled out of Montreal Locomotive Works in April 1929, and she was breathtaking. A 210 4-wheel arrangement, 10 driving wheels, each 63 inches in diameter. That's more contact with the rail than anything Canadian Pacific had ever run, but here's where the genius came in. They made her an oil burner instead of coal. Why? Weight distribution. A coal tender would have pushed the whole rig over 400 tons, and that would have violated track weight limits. Oil kept it at 523 tons, fully loaded, heavy, but legal. The boiler, 275 pounds per square inch of steam pressure. The cylinders, 25 by 32 inches, could convert that steam into 78,000 pounds of tractive effort at 75% boiler pressure. And when you needed that extra kick on a grade, hit the booster, another 12,000 pounds of push from the trailing truck. I want you to understand what that meant in practical terms. A Selkirk could take a 1,500-ton freight train up those Selkirk grades alone. No helper engines, no double-heading, 1 locomotive, 1 crew, 1 fuel stop. The first test run was Calgary to Revelstoke, April 1929. Engineer names lost to history, but his report isn't. She pulls like 10 men and eats mountains for breakfast. They knocked 2 hours off the schedule. 2 hours. That's not an improvement, that's a revolution. By 1930, they'd ordered 19 more. The T1 class was born. Now here's where the story gets legendary. Summer of 1931, somewhere between Field and Hector. A Selkirk, I think it was 5907, but the records are fuzzy, was pulling the eastbound Dominion passenger train. 16 cars full of people heading back to Toronto, and they were running late because of a rockslide delay further west. The engineer gets clearance, make up the time however you can. So he does what any sane man with 500 tons of locomotive would do. He opens her up. Through the spiral tunnels, past Cathedral Mountain. The fireman's watching the water level, the pressure gauge, making sure everything stays in the green. Passengers are probably wondering why their coffee's sliding across the table. The superintendent riding in the cab, yeah, there was a super on board that day, he's watching the speedometer climb, 50 miles per hour, 60. On mountain grades where the posted limit was 45. The locomotive's working, but she's not straining. The steam's flowing smooth, the drivers are gripping like they're bolted to the rails, and for the first time in Canadian Pacific history, a train this heavy is actually accelerating uphill. They made up 47 minutes by the time they hit Calgary, 47 minutes on a route where every minute counted. The superintendent filed a report. The Selkirk performed beyond specification. Recommend full deployment across Mountain Division. And just like that, the Selkirks became the undisputed kings of the Rockies. That moment when the Selkirk proved what she could do, pure engineering perfection. But if you think that's where the story ends, you're in for a surprise. Drop a comment. Did steam power peak with machines like this, or was diesel inevitable? And stick around, because what happened next is heartbreaking. But you know how this story ends, don't you? Because every story about steam power ends the same way. Through the 1930s and 40s, the Selkirks dominated. They hauled everything. Silk trains, troop trains during the war. Endless freight consists full of wheat and timber. 36 of them were eventually built, the last batch in 1949. That final locomotive, number 5935, was actually the last standard-gauge steam locomotive built in Canada for a Canadian railway. Think about that. The end of an entire era rolled into one machine, but by the mid-1950s, the writing was on the wall. Diesel-electric locomotives were coming. They were cleaner, more efficient, didn't need water stops every 100 miles. They could multiple unit, hook 3 diesels together and get the power of 3 locomotives with 1 crew. The economics were brutal and undeniable. In 1954, Canadian Pacific started retiring the Selkirks. These magnificent machines that had conquered mountains, that had redefined what was possible in steam traction, were suddenly obsolete. By 1959, every single one was out of service, 30 years from birth to death. Most were scrapped, cut apart for the steel. 523 tons of engineering excellence reduced to rebar and scrap metal. Can you imagine watching that? If you were an engineer who'd spent decades in those cabs, feeling that power under your hands, and then seeing her cut apart with torches. Only 2 survived, 2 out of 36. Number 5931 sits today at Heritage Park in Calgary. Number 5935, that last built Selkirk, the last standard gauge steam locomotive made in Canada, she's at the Canadian Railway Museum in St. Constant, Quebec. Both are static displays. They'll never steam again. I've stood next to 5931, run my hand along her driving wheels. And the thing that gets me is this. She's not particularly beautiful. Not like those streamlined Hudsons or the elegant Northerns. The Selkirks were built for one purpose, raw, unstoppable power. And they delivered. But here's what I think about when I look at her. For 30 years, these locomotives moved an entire nation's economy over mountains that should have been impassable. They carried soldiers to war and brought them home. They hauled the wheat that fed millions. They proved that human engineering could overcome nature's biggest obstacles. And then we threw them away, not because they failed. They didn't, though they worked perfectly right to the end. We threw them away because something better came along. That's the deal with progress, isn't it? Today's miracle is tomorrow's museum piece, but 523 tons doesn't just disappear from memory. Those two surviving Selkirk stand as monuments to an age when bigger wasn't just better, it was necessary. When the biggest, heaviest, most powerful locomotive in the British Empire was exactly what Canada needed to become Canada. The Selkirks conquered mountains, and history couldn't conquer them. Thanks for riding the rails with me on this one. If this story moved you, share it with someone who appreciates the machines that built our world. Check out the description for museum links where you can see these giants in person. And hit that like button, it tells me you want more forgotten stories like this. Until next time, keep history alive.